it's not the time to celebrate, but it's time to raise some pressing issues. And those pressing issues, when we speak in the context of the war in Ukraine, are the military aspects, the situation on the battleground. And I'm very much concerned, and we're all very much concerned, because I have to remind ourselves, it is a famous quote by Ernest Hemingway. He was speaking actually about the bankruptcy. But to rephrase it, the defeat takes place gradually, and then it happens suddenly. So it's very important for the health reminder, not to Ukrainians, but to our partners in the West, to know what that means, essentially. And there is also the diplomatic efforts. Is diplomacy completely outgunned, or there is still space for diplomacy? So I would just be making highlights, without expanding, because then this hour would not be enough for us. The next point to discuss, it's about the Western strategy, the never-ending debate about strategic clarity, strategic ambiguity. And I fully subscribe to what my esteemed colleague has said from Ukraine. There is no issue. The safest response to formulate that the international law should prevail. And that prevalence of the international law means the territorial sovereignty, integrity, and availability of the borders. But on the operational level, what a victory and what defeat means. And those are very crucial points, because a definition of victory, a definition of defeat has been evolving through the course of this war. And it's never had any sort of the static definition. And the last point, it's about post-war Ukrainian security guarantees. And that's now we're proceeding to Georgia, because as we're saying, the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine, it's about the new security design in Eurasia and our part of the world. So while there's a famous saying, I think that Anthony Blinken was mentioning, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It's time for Georgians, it's time for Georgian diplomacy. It's time for Georgian authorities to be more affirmative, saying that nothing about Georgia without Georgia. And that exactly goes, without decoupling from Ukraine and sticking together, as much as possible. Now, sorry for this introduction, but I was sort of warming up myself and the audience as well. Now, about Georgia. So, the reality and the irony of the war of Ukraine, that when Russia has written a big chapter in 2008, and that was the first salvo to destroy the Second World Post-War order in Europe. The West has not read that chapter carefully. We've overlooked that. Then the second chapter was written in 2014, was annexation Crimea. We again overlooked that. Now Russia is writing the next chapter, and very extensively. It's about, and by the way, it's not about invasion, it's about reinvasion. Exactly because of the second chapter, so others are arguing that that's sticking to the correct connotations. So now it's time for Georgia to get back to the agenda, to the international agenda, remind the international audience that the challenges for Ukraine go hand in hand with the Georgian challenges, the Georgian agenda. So this is one point. The second point, it's about the shape of international order. Major powers have a big luxury to allow themselves to deviate from international order. Small states do not have such a luxury. And the biggest shield of defense for them is international order. So that's once again an opportunity for us. And this is sort of the takeaway as well. There are some few other takeaways, ironically enough, the war in Ukraine has opened new opportunities for us as well, and that opportunity, I don't want to focus exactly at the middle corridor. If not the war in Ukraine, ironically, and therefore excuse myself referring to the ambassador of Poland saying that we will be raising the pressing issues, the middle corridor would stay on the shelf, but Georgia has to capitalize on that, because this is the opportunity which is happening probably once in 100 years. And the last but not the very least, any war is a crisis, and any war is an emergency. But discussing the crisis in times of the crisis could be quite light if you don't make some prep work before. And that preparation for Because as we see the world, as I'm saying, this is the order without any planning. But the list of the planning which we have to make to be better prepared for future crises, which would be repeating, don't kid ourselves. The war in Ukraine would not be the last crisis in Eurasia or in Europe. So the best preparations is the resilience of democracy, because this country has nothing else. No nuclear weaponry, no military fights, no sort of economic might, but rather the destruction of its democracy. And that democratic resilience goes through the sustainability of its economy and the capability of its institutions. And so probably I would rather conclude here when you ask me about the takeaways for Georgia. I started with a bigger picture and tried to focus as much as I could on the Georgia lessons. Thank you.
Sure, I'm gonna push a bit more. I mean, you have been strategizing a bit with your analytical pieces. So what is the Georgian definition of victory in Ukraine?
So the definition is very simple. We were the victims of the very aggressive the Russian expansionist policies. There is a moral side of the story, but there is also a pragmatic side of the story. Morality requires us to stand next to Ukraine. But rationality also requires us to stand next to Ukraine, because if something goes wrong with Ukraine, no one could provide with safest with security guarantees to Georgia, so they would definitely be ripple effect. And that international, that context is really very important, because we found ourselves in the midst of various sort of rigor issues in the Western politics. It was mentioned here on a few occasions that the West is consolidated. Of course, no one questions that the West is consolidated. There is no issue about consolidating the Western intentions. But what we are talking about, is the operational code of conduct. That's extremely different thing. Because what we're witnessing again, from the Georgian perspectives, because I like this word as well, to be the prison of geography. We're the prison of geography, so therefore it's very important for us how things will go on. And as we're witnessing a completely new type of interstate war after the Second World War, which we would not witness before. And I realize, there is no recipe for those pressing issues. But on the other side, again, reassessing the reality and looking into the eyes of the sobering realities, that will be very, very important. And one last point, this war, it's not also about forming up a resilient Ukrainian identity. And it's not only about Georgia taking its place, at least on the regional map, but it's also about the reverse of the West. The West, which has been pending, in the conditions of complacency and acquiescence since the end of the Cold War. And of course, I'm always saying that with all my gratitude, appreciation, if not the Western support, Georgia would not be as it is to these days. But we always had a sense, there was some limits in that sort of not to step beyond that comfort zone. So the war in Ukraine pushing the West, to give more definitive response. And definitive responses and to step beyond that comfort zone. And again, this is also a very historical opportunity for us to catch up with the process as well. Great political involvement of Georgia in resolving the conflict in Ukraine. Sure. It's an interesting construct.
Okay, I may frame it a bit differently.
Let me reframe and let me also sort of engage myself. I think that's the best example which Georgia could portray. I'm sort of a supporter of this school of realism and realistic thinking. So, but now let me switch to the idealist section of the international politics. I think that the best way for Georgia is to portray itself as having that morality compass. So I think that's the best way for Georgia to position itself. I'm not mentioning that we're doing all we could, and of course it's a very arguable question in this issue whether there's anything on the security field, but I think that the morality compass, and when we speak about the morality compass, I also think that it's very important for Georgia to stand very unequivocally in the battle of narratives as well. Because you could have well-declared objectives, but still intentions could be a bit different. Of course, we could speculate about those intentions. It's always good that there is no room for speculations. Therefore, I'm saying that the morality compass, especially in the battling of narratives, it's very important. And one more addition to what Mike from Ukraine said, which is not directly related to your question, but still to introduce this way of thinking. Completing the war in Ukraine would not be the last chapter in Europe, and I think that while we spoke about certain complacency, etc., it's time for all of us, including Georgia and our partners in the West, preparing ourselves for the long policy of containment. It's very arguable, but still, it's something I believe very much in. So, once on the Georgian TV, I was asked, would the war would be completed if Putin would be killed? I was on live, I couldn't say what a stupid question it is. So, my concern that with Putin in Russia, without Putin, Russia's challenge would not be solved. There's one word which has entered the English language from Russian, and one is systema. Systema always sort of produces. So unless that systema would not be dismantled, of course, speaking about defeating Russia in Ukraine would not be about eliminating the risks and the threats from Russia. And therefore, I think that long policy of containment, would be very much, has to be very much in minds. What we see these days that Kremlin's policy is banking on the Western divisions, and they're cashing quite well on it. So this is the reality for all of us to provide to be prepared for the containment, and also finality, the final objective of that containment, and the most sort of helpful resolution of the Russian challenge is getting Russia to normal. And therefore, I was reading a few other suggestions which are in minority that, in one way or another, investing into the process of getting Russia normal, which would be a very, very long exercise, would be the ultimate resolution. Otherwise, those threats and those challenges would not go anywhere. And especially important for us because you can't change the geography, and we're in very much peculiar part of the geography. And so, therefore, for us, having the ultimate, final, and irrevocable resolution of the Russian challenge is about Russia at least having putting itself within the limits and reasonable limits of international law, and then also about recognizing its neighborhood and recognizing the choice of its neighborhood to pursue those objectives which the neighborhood wants to pursue. And 10 seconds in that respect. I also appeal and very kindly request the international community never use in relation to Georgia this connotation of ethnic conflicts. Of course, those are having the features of ethnicity, but those in the first instance are reaction of Russia to our foreign policy objectives. So please don't downgrade those conflicts in the Georgian soil. Those conflicts are of much bigger scale. And those are the reaction of our choice on the foreign region. Thank you.
Russia, are we losing the momentum now?
I think probably now too much focus, and rightly is focused on the military aspects, and it can be any other advice. But when I mentioned diplomacy without guns, probably it's not a very right analogy. And I realized that this expression that any war ends with peace treaty on ceasefire, and it's also a big gap between a peace treaty and ceasefire, which is more realistic in Ukraine and which would be more durable or less durable. It's another point which won't be able to argue now. But I remember the analogy of Korean War, and I think that at some point the time for speaking with Russia would come. And I think it would be the very right moment for diplomacy, laying down the channels for starting those talks. I know it's quite hard. It's not about exact timing. It's not about, at this point, exact terms and conditions. We all listened, to interview of Putin with Tucker. So actually, objectives of Russia have not changed at all. It's completely impossible to speak with Russia on any terms and conditions or with a peace treaty or ceasefire at this point. But laying down the channels of communications already starting would be very much right moment, because again, getting back to the Korean War, I think 2 years have passed since the sides have started talking with each other and then reaching the ceasefire agreement of nearly 40 pages. So I think for our European partners and US would be very much important as well, adding more clarity to the strategic approach to the region as well. Thank you. Nevertheless, this is the framework that is set up, and we have still to focus on some think tank issues, if I may. So very quickly on the resilience issue, and excuse if I won't be able to follow exactly how you framed it, and in terms of time constraints as well. Yesterday I had from Umarov, he's the Minister of Defense, that there's the delay in the deliveries up to 50%, 50, this is catastrophic. So we're sitting here, we're discussing, we're enacting resolutions, etc., etc. This figure, speaks for itself. And again, it goes to your question about of course, the capability there, perhaps. There's much talks about the defense industry, so forth and so on, but it's probably not a very much excuse in these circumstances, when people are really, sitting in the trenches. And as we said, and we have again to repeat, that the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine, it's about all of us. So this is one point which I have to mention necessarily. The second point about also resilience and our self-reliance. At some point several years ago, I was traveling to the US, and when I had some meetings there, when I opened the meeting, with some officials. They never expected, for a Georgian to say what I've said. I said, thank you, gentlemen, we came here not to look for a geopolitical babysitter. And that was very crucial, because being self-reliant, and self-reliance also means, accountability, transparency. I personally don't believe, probably it's a very awkward analogy, but it's no semi-pregnancy. It's a pregnancy of you can't be semi-democratic, you can't be semi-accountable. I'm speaking now from Georgian perspective. You can't be hybrid as well. You should be on one side, either or another side, and it also goes to the resilience issue. So unless we Georgians and Ukrainians feel themselves comfortable enough to pay respect to ourselves in terms of believing in our self-resilience and then communicating that message to our Western partners, and then also demanding from them to quit, that if you're involved between, boosterism and the doomsdaying, that what we see in the Western politics these days. And therefore, when we speak about the battling narratives, there's one misperception, which I, of course, I disagree with, that these days Russia seems to be more committed to the war in Ukraine than the West seems to. Fortunately, that's a reality. And then the Middle East comes into the play with the battling narrative, and the Western domestic politics, and the Donald Trump's factor. So there are so many issues which have to be mentioned in the context of the war in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine, as I've said, is not just about Bakhmut or Avdiivka. It's a bigger picture. It's a bigger picture of rebirth of the West, and all of us was you as well. So probably that's a bit of chaotic and spontaneous response to your question about resiliency. But that's what I wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, and most sincerely. Thank you.